I started out so optimistic this morning. So I'm going to open it up to questions. So we're going to have, let me ask somebody who hasn't had a chance to speak. Ma'am. Yeah, yes. Please. If you could.
Just a comment. You asked about the China, the two intriguing cases on your list. I think it's quite likely that Trump is going to pursue these because each of them has very substantial sponsorship from stakeholders, and specifically metal industry stakeholders who are well represented in this administration. The subsidy, the one about overcapacity, absolutely. This is definitely on the steel agenda for the U.S. Raw materials is a rerun of earlier cases with new products. So expect those to continue. About Section 232, I don't think, I think if you think about a little history, there is substantial history on this. Every time the U.S. has come close to being sued on national security, it has backed away. In the Nicaragua brought a GATT case against the U.S. in the middle 80s. Remember about the embargo? The U.S. blocked the terms of reference until they excluded. They prevented the panel from possibly ruling on Article 21. Helms-Burton, okay? The EU brought a case on Helms-Burton, and basically what the U.S. did is that they said they would walk out. The Clinton administration said, sorry, we will not participate. Why? There was a huge hand-wringing going on in trade land over this, but in fact, if the U.S. had shown up and lost, it would have been really, really bad. If you think about executive congressional relations, and that when the Uruguay round was passed, the Uruguay round bill was passed, the administration said then that the WTO could never overrule a U.S. security determination. Supposing the U.S. brought the Article 21 case and won, however, think about that. So basically, so this explains why the walkout and why, in fact, it was a good thing that the U.S. and the EU eventually arrived at a settlement of Helms-Burton that involved no panel and no litigation. I think other countries as well really have no interest in delineating exactly when you can pull the trigger on national security in the WTO and when you can't.
So I would like, if we can, to keep these to questions, if we could, please. Tom?
Tom Bruscher from Rutgers. James, I thought it was really interesting, an early slide where you were quoting Bob Lighthizer, where he was basically saying the WTO doesn't actually constrain what we do. And then at the end, he finishes that we're going to use the WTO to force China to behave according to WTO rules. So there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between what we think the WTO means for other people versus what it means for us.
Okay. In the back row. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Li Yang. My comment is really not just for this panel, it's really for the whole conference. And just a very good conference. But as a citizen and a consumer and a buyers and a businessman, I would suspect our trade is not really fair trade or free trade. I think we should go on that direction. And we have mentioned the democracy, the election, the Trump, and we have mentioned the Congress. Actually, the Congress now, just like Patriot Act, it's really depend on who issue and who want you to listen to. Just like Bush, everybody just pass. And now you have Trump, Congress just one-sided pass. So if we have this kind of trade, and then, of course, you are fantastic to calculate those figures. Now, normal people, they don't calculate that. And even if you calculate that, now, who is going to have in the back have a kind of what I call unjust influence. So almost, especially those small countries, cannot win. So probably Trump can have all the orders, whether it is executive order, whether you need a Congress to pass or not. So I just wonder if we can have some kind of advisor group to tell Trump or to go through the Congress that we must do something based on the principle of fair trade and based on the principle to benefit the consumers rather than with all those sophisticated formula that nobody can win except Trump and their group, millionaires.
Okay, so why don't, do you want to respond to some of these comments?
Yeah, sure. So the comment on national security, I completely agree, Amy, with everything you said. I think and I've written a sort of history of the invocation of the national security exception, which I would commend to all of you, and for the Columbia Institute for Sustainable Development. And you're right. There have been a couple of occasions where the where the WTO, or previous to that, the GATT, have come to the edge, walked right up to the edge, about testing this proposition about the justiciability of the national security exception. And people walked away. The question, I think, this time is whether or not the measures that President Trump would impose are so much more significant than those that countries may have no choice but to press if it were a 35% across-the-board tariff. Are they going to be willing to step back simply because the United States invoked the essential security exception? Maybe, because maybe they'll say it's for the good of the system, but maybe not, because the commercial impact is so significant. And if the U.S. is basically, trying to say it politely, telling the WTO to go away, then they may say, well, then what's the point in trying to preserve the system for the sake of that? I don't know. We'll just have to see how it plays out over time. But your comments are well taken. On the disconnect, I agree with that too. There is clearly a disconnect between saying we don't need to adhere to the rules, and on the other hand saying we're going to hold other countries to the rules. That's a clear disconnect. And I think part of the reason why we've always said we need to adhere to the rules previously has been because we want other countries to comply, and we lose that moral high ground if we don't. If we simply say we don't need to adhere, these are just guidelines, not binding rules. But simply because there's an inconsistency doesn't mean that that's not the policy that's going to be pursued. Well, again, we'll just have to wait and see. On the third comment, I wasn't entirely sure I understood what the question was, but if the idea is we need to focus on consumer benefit, which I think you said at the end of the comment, that's clearly part of the argument in favor of free trade. That's what we've always tried to say, that over time, prices will come down, the overall benefit to society is greater, and so on. All of that's true, and I think those arguments need to continue to be made. But the problem that we've had is the problem that others have recognized in previous panels is there are significant pockets of society or industrial sectors that don't feel that benefit directly, or the pain that they feel far outweighs the benefit. And they have now come to the fore. Now it's come time for a reckoning on this. How do we deal with that? What do we do to help those folks? And do we need a new trade policy to grapple with it? And what does it look like? And I don't think anybody really knows at this point. But it's an issue that we're going to have to deal with head on.
The only quick comment I would make is to Amy. I agree with you completely that the raw materials and aluminum subsidies cases are teed up for this new administration. My point is we'll see if they're serious about fixing underlying problems that China is subsidizing, that China is using export restrictions, or if they really mean that, or if they just want to start turning inward and impose import restrictions because they can. So they might stay to stop pursuing the case against aluminum subsidies and just do CVDs or 45% tariff or whatever. On the raw materials case, they may say, well, we're not going to pursue that anymore. We don't need that stuff from China. We're going to have a mine in the U.S. initiative, right? And we're going to go find our own cobalt and molybdenum. And I don't know where this stuff is, but maybe we can dig it out of the ground here, as incredibly dirty and polluting as that might be.
So, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm Paul Dahmer from the World Dialogue.
So if you
Thank
could
you very
wait
much.
for
I think
the
this has been,
microphone.
has been very interesting. I just wanted to see if we can go a little bit forward. I think that you've all stopped from sort of taking the next step, which is what if Trump does impose the 45% tariff on the imports? Has anybody done any studies on sort of what the effect this would be in terms of how much it would hurt the U.S., how much it would hurt the world, a trade war? Because I think it's quite important to sort of anticipate that given the way things are going, and at least to put on paper what the economic impact would be, both on the U.S. and on the world. So I'm very interested in seeing if there are any studies along those lines.
So I'm heartened and disheartened. So we at the Peterson Institute, not me, but colleagues of mine, put together a major study trying to, well, to address this very issue and to try to get it out into the public domain in the discussion, even in advance of the election when these proposals were being bandied about. And so, yes, I would invite you to go to the Peterson website. There's a study by Sherman Robinson and Mark Noland and Tyler Moran that does this specifically and tries to break it out geographically. You know, according to geography, what sorts of counties in the United States might be most affected by retaliation if it were to actually occur, what products, where the job losses would come up, how that would feed into other areas of the economy. And so, yeah, we've tried to the extent that the word has gotten out there or not is I guess not fully yet. Hopefully it will, though, in advance of actually any of these policies being implemented. There's still time.
Oh, Steve?
Thank you. Two great presentations. I had a question for James, though. I was puzzled by your thesis that joining the WTO somehow shrunk the U.S. toolbox for market access. And so you focused on quotas and tariffs. Those don't strike me as tools for market access. The tools for market access, which I think have really increased since we joined the WTO, is the ability to file cases. And Chad very nicely suggested some possible new cases that could be filed on some novel issues. We've got WTO committees, and we could make them more transparent. Perhaps that would help. We've used accession agreements to grade in for more market access. So there are lots of tools the WTO has given us. I don't see the landscape as one of fewer tools. And if we need more tools to convince other countries to change, then, I mean, there are lots of things we can do outside of the trade regime. We can cut off visas. We can have banking sanctions. I mean, send drones, whatever we need. But I don't know why your first thought would be, to get market access, let's put a tariff on another country.
So if we can get a couple more questions in and then we'll respond. So, ma'am?
Thank you. My name is Anne Callenberry. I work at the French Embassy, and I have a question regarding the VAT. So a number of members of the new administration have argued that the VAT gives the 150 countries that have it a competitive advantage. So why isn't it discussed in the US? We know it's WTO consistent. So why go through this whole border adjustment tax ordeal if there is another solution that is already WTO consistent? Might be a very naive question. I don't know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question. So in the far back, please.
Zach Lawrence, GW Law. My question is for Chad Brown. I'm curious, in your presentation, you were talking about the border adjustment tax and how it might be de facto discriminatory for different countries under the MFN. I'm wondering why you didn't look at it under Article 2 and our tariff schedule.
Okay, so I think we got 3 questions.
Okay, I'll answer one of them. The other two, I think, are for you. So the shrunken toolbox question. I mean, look, to be clear, I'm a big advocate of the WTO and WTO dispute settlement. I think it works well to the extent it works. Okay, a bit of a tautology, but it's when there are commitments that address a particular issue or problem, it generally works pretty well. You know, there are claims that can be brought. There's a dispute settlement process. It takes a while, whatever, so do court cases. But eventually, by and large, countries comply. That's a tool we didn't have before. I completely agree with that. The frustration, I think, is that the rule, and this is what I was saying as well, the rules are not comprehensive. So there are large gaping holes in what it does, because it's not intended to be a comprehensive regulatory framework for global commerce. It's very high-level principles, non-discrimination, a little bit of market access, general principles on standards and so forth, terrible commitments on services, by and large. So in those gaps, and those gaps are very large, and, you know, they were going to be. This was our first real attempt to do something really meaningful. I mean, outside of GATT, but I don't necessarily mean that as you know, well, there are large gaps, and the question is, what do you do to fill those gaps? What's left? Because you can't retaliate and be consistent with the WTO. You can't retaliate in the way we used to retaliate by raising tariffs. And if you don't want to send the drones in, you know, what's left? I mean, I can tell you, I sat through many, many meetings at USTR trying to deal with some of these issues. Like, what do we do? What is the toolbox? And there are different things you can try to dream up. You know, diplomatic pressure, you know, mechanisms to sort of force deliverables at summits, and, you know, various other things, or name and shame exercises, a variety of things like that. But, you know, I think the critics will say, and they're not entirely wrong about it, is it's not as effective as true economic pressures, turning the screw a little bit. Now, you know, whether we want to return to that system where, you know, it's every man for himself and so on, is a different question. But those tools that we used to have to bring that economic pressure to bear are no longer there. You know, for example, in the mid-90s, there was, I think, $1 billion of retaliation against China for IP issues. You can't do that anymore unless you get a WTO ruling, and, you know, and you're allowed to retaliate at that level. So, you know, what do you do in those situations? That's the frustration, is the rules are not comprehensive. The rules haven't caught up to global commerce, and yet there's nothing the U.S. can do. At least there's a sense of helplessness on a lot of this. And I think that's part of the frustration. I think that's part of what's driving this reaction that led to Trump on trade, is we've neutered ourselves, and what have we gotten in return? There's still all these gigantic problems, and you're telling us we can't do anything about it. And that's frustrating.
So I would just echo that and say that, you know, if you're thinking about China in particular, you know, I think the recognition has been that the old GATT rules, WTO rules to deal with China just aren't sufficient. And so, you know, as I interpret what the Obama administration ultimately tried to do as a long-term strategy, was to say we're not going to see these rules changes happening within the WTO system in isolation, because we don't have any leverage. So the way we get around that then is by pursuing something like TPP, and write in rules on state-owned enterprises, on, you know, digital stuff, on the standards that we care about. And those are the rules that we're most concerned about China ultimately addressing over the long term. It's not WTO, but you know, hopefully the sort of preferences that would then be inherent in the TPP agreement through all these other countries joining would want China to want to ultimately join that agreement, and that in and of itself would be a starting point of negotiations that we currently don't have leverage in under the WTO. So I viewed that as sort of a long-term strategy. Clearly, the Trump administration didn't take the same view. On the questions about why not a VAT, I think that's a great question, and there's a number of different ways that you could tackle it, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. There's a lot of political, you know, issues in the United States about how different folks think we should tax, and it's very much been a non-starter for years. Even when you get beyond that, there are issues that come up with there's, you know, strong efficiency arguments for it from an economics perspective, but then it raises new kind of equity and regressivity concerns as well. So there's big picture questions here, but it's a really, really fair question. The question about why not Article 2 is because it's not a tariff. It's not an import tariff. The border adjustment it's part of the destination-based cash flow tax. In the VAT regime, it's part of the VAT tax. It's part of the domestic tax regime. So it wouldn't, I don't think it would be easily challengeable under Article 2. And it's from an economist perspective, even in the current proposal, that's not the element of it that's discriminatory, that ends up being discriminatory. What ends up being discriminatory is the wage deduction that only is granted to US-based production, which gives a preference to US-based production that then, you know, is manifest by how labor intensive or how big the labor share is of a given industry relative to foreign competition, right? And so that's why you wouldn't be able to just use kind of an Article 2 challenge. You would have to, at least in my view, you know, go after the sort of national treatment argument.
Just one word on that. I agree with that. It probably is more Article 3 than Article 2, but I think if it were Article 2, I think if there's a challenge, there will probably be challenges in the alternative, claims in the alternative. And if someone wanted, if the panel said it's not 3, it's 2, chances are they would find a violation of 2 as well, because it would go above, it would significantly raise tariffs above the tariff bindings that the United States has, so.
And listen to him because he's the one who's paid to be a lawyer, not me.
So actually, Chad, I'd like to follow up on that. Jay Shamba and I were talking yesterday about the possibility of just a straight border adjustment tax combined with a separate wage subsidy. So you get to the issue that you're trying to, which I think is to help workers. I think that's the bottom line. And maybe this is for Jim, but for both of you, whether or not separating these two policies might be an alternative to reach what seem like two separate goals.
Or, right, so potentially, I would defer to the lawyers on that. I mean, I think there's still some question about the current form of how the destination-based cash flow tax is being articulated, that legal scholars don't find to necessarily be WTO consistent. But I think on the economic issue, it goes as well. If ultimately what you're trying to do through the wage subsidy is perhaps to at least to offset the economic impact of the existing payroll tax, then there might be an argument for just repealing the payroll tax, right? And then you're left with essentially a pure VAT, which the trade lawyers tell us is WTO consistent, and then Bob's your uncle, as the Australians say. But I guess we're not friends with them anymore either. So.
Any thoughts, Counselor? No. Okay. Well, about this, you have thoughts, but it's not about this. Okay. Any other last questions? Well, we are at the end. I do want to say that when we initially thought about this conference, it was about what President Trump can and cannot do to alter trade policy. I think the answer is potentially a lot, but we don't know what it is yet. But I think today has given us an opportunity to have a structure to think about it, to know what to look for, to understand where there might be disputes. And I want to thank all of the panelists for, I think, just really a terrific set of presentations today, mine excluded. But we will have, I believe, Kyle, and thanks to Kyle and all the team for putting together a great conference. Really appreciate it. They work hard with absent-minded professors, and I'm not going to go into any details about that, but it's really great to have you help with that. Kyle, I believe that this is going to be the materials are going to be available on our website. Is that correct? Okay, so for those of you who missed parts of this and you want to get to some of this information, we'll have it accessible later. Just Google IAEP Trump. I think you'll get it.
Protecting the trade orthodoxy in the last stage.
Yeah, that's right. All right, very good. Thank you very much, everybody.